This video has been sponsored by World of Warships. Piracy is a grim subject of the history books. The lives of these salty scoundrels are wrought by pain and misery, and seldom feature a happy ending. Most pirates met their end at the point of a sword or a few essential feet above the safety of earth, dancing away their last humours as the life they held dear slowly strangled out of them. They went to sea dreaming of easy gold, but earned only what awaits all of us, rich and poor, only much, and tragically, earlier. Yet, digging through the sand dark and wet, we can find among those jagged grains a few glittering corns, those extraordinary stories of pirates who retired in peace and comfort. It has been much debated across the interwebs of who was the most successful of the sea dogs. Often cited are Bartholomew Roberts, Blackbeard, Sam Bellamy. Yet, chief among them was a name which few of us remember. He came out of the Caribbean aboard a ship named Dragon, seeking his fortune in the East. They said he had only one hand, yet it would not stop him. He pirated, he slavered, he trucked, he got real clever, and when he had filled his chest, he took up with the French, got himself a purdy missus, and settled as a merchant in Frenchland. His name was Billy One Hand, and this be his story. Any pirate would have had an easy time if he had access to an aircraft carrier. He could pretty much glide into Port Royal, sink all of the ships, take all the gold, and then send it into the sea for a second time, too soon. Sadly, this would have been physically impossible, but you can still live out your high seas fantasies with today's sponsor, World of Warships.
Whoa!
This game is pretty straightforward. You have a big ship made of metal, you sail on the sea, and you destroy the ships using cool explosions. You have everything from battleships to my own personal favorite, as someone sneaky who likes to destroy international commerce every now and then, submarines. You can play both as a lone wolf and with friends, on both PC and consoles, and best of all, the game is completely free. All you need to do is follow the link in the video description, register, and if you use my promo code BRAVO, you receive a huge starter pack, including 500 doubloons, 1.5 million credits, 7 days of premium account time, and a free ship after you complete 15 battles, so get out there. Again, follow the link, download the game and use promo code BRAVO, and then you can play until you vomit your black guts out and fall overboard. Thanks again to World of Warships for sponsoring this video. Back to Billy. Across the lurid pages of the internet, Billy is often called Christopher Condent. He never appeared as such in period documents, and the name itself can be traced no earlier than 1953, when he was referred to as Christopher Condent in a book, Jolly Roger, The Story of the Golden Age of Piracy, written by one Patrick Pringle. No relation to the Chips Man, I think.
You will regret that purchase.
In a story published in a 1926 newspaper, he's called, oddly enough, Jerry Condent. This might have been some sort of joke, though I'm not laughing. In that age-old book, a source of so many legends and misconceptions, A General History of the Pirates, Billy simply goes by the alias of Captain Condent. His first name never provided, and indeed, 'tis tricky to know for certain. Period documents invariably call him Edmund, John, and William. The French called him Edward, and this was the name he went by when he signed his marriage contract with Marie-Catherine Ancret in Port Louis, 1723. In this here document, he likewise declared himself a native of Plymouth, an eastern province of Old England, home of the Cornish and the pirate accent. Many famous pirates came out of this weather-beaten coast, most famously Henry Every. Edward must have grown up listening to the legends of the King of Pirates, and they certainly inspired him to sail east and to build his own little pirate kingdom on the island of Madagascar. His last name is as tricky as the first one. Documents call him Condent, Connor, Condell. No one calling him Condom, fortunately, though again, the French and he himself used the variant of Congdon. Thus, we'll have to trust that his true name was Edward Congdon. As for the nickname of Billy One Hand, that is a charming but sadly modern invention, lovingly used by historians and archaeologists who have hunted for his sunken treasure. But he did indeed have only one hand, as was attested by the unfortunate souls to end up on the other end of his gun, though he might have only been able to use a pistol. However, the records are silent on how he lost his gripper. Some say he shook hands with a shark, others say he stuck it in a cookie jar full of piranhas, others say he liked to play with himself a bit too roughly. According to our old friend, Captain Charlie Johnson, Condon and his crew had managed to piss off an Indian crewman by treating him quite like dirt. The Indian decided to take his revenge by barricading himself below deck and threatening to blow up the entire sloop. Some of the men advised throwing down grenades, but Condon said it was too dangerous. It might set off the powder mag and blow up the entire sloop. So, taking a pistol in one hand and a cutlass in the other, he leapt headlong into the hold. The Indian fired a piece at him, which shattered Edward's arm, but he won the fight regardless. With the Indian dead, the crew hacked him to pieces. The gunner ripped open his belly, tore out his heart, broiled, and ate it. For his bravery, Edward was elected captain. Like so many yarns spun in Johnson's book, this one seems mightily dramatic and perhaps a tad out of touch, especially the part about eating someone's heart. Johnson had a sense for the dramatic and sensational in order to keep his readers reading, often making up details out of the blue in order to make the stories more fun. But perchance there's a grain of truth to Johnson's yarn. An eyewitness confirms that Edward did indeed have only one hand, between his departing of Providence and arrival in the Azores, within the time span of Johnson's story. These sorts of injuries were quite common, but they would usually make a man retire from a life at sea, so Billy is quite impressive in his perseverance. Otherwise, Johnson's account of Congdon is both short and garbled at the same time. Many of the deeds attributed to him can either not be backed up by other sources or have been stolen from other accounts. Johnson claims that Congdon partook in the battles against the Cassandra and the Nossa Senhora do Cabo, even though the records reveal his absence. Oddly enough, Johnson's account of Congdon's career directly contradicts with his more accurate account of Richard Taylor. Another point as to why this book is so strange and cannot be trusted. It often contradicts itself. We know not when Edward left his home to become a sailor, but he evidently had a love for the sea. Even after his retirement, he'd continue cruising upon the blue. By 1718, he had become a pirate captain. Piracy was on its final legs, the limeys were tightening the noose, and the HMS Phoenix had recently occupied the pirate nest of New Providence. In a letter to the Admiralty, Captain Vincent Pierce reported that Congdon had departed Providence on the 5th of February, with 98 men and a sloop named Dragon, armed with 12 6-pounders and 12 swivel guns. Congdon's plan seemed to be to expand his company and acquire a bigger ship, with which to cruise in Brazil and eventually Africa. By March, the company had grown to 130, and they had captured the ship Alexander, mounting her with 22 guns. It seems they rechristened her as the New Dragon, and eventually boosted her armament to 40 guns. But the exact origins of the ship Dragon have been disputed. Johnson claimed she was Dutch and called her Flying Dragon. Some modern scholars have called her Fiery Dragon, but neither of those names seem to appear in period sources, where she's merely called Dragon. But Congdon seems to have captained at least more than one ship named Dragon. It's uncertain how many exactly. By August of 1718, he sailed in concert with a certain Captain Butcher, commander of the rover, believed by some to have been the infamous Olivier Levasseur. They captured several ships around the Azores, and next it seems as though he sailed to Brazil. By early 1719, he had returned to New Providence and taken the king's pardon. But his plans were far from sedentary. Still in command of the 40-gun Dragon, Congdon's intention was to sail to Madagascar and engage in the slave trade. By September of 1719, he was back across the Atlantic, where he stumbled into a strange encounter with a pair of Portuguese men of war, 20 leagues off the Azores. They asked him who he was and where he was bound, to which he responded that he was a man of war bound from Guinea to Lisbon to Careen. They ordered him to come aboard, but instead he sent a lieutenant, who feigned to have forgotten his papers. They sent him back with the news that they were preparing to engage. Much to Congdon's joy, it proved a feint. The Portuguese disengaged. The dragon continued. It is entirely possible that, after taking the pardon, Congdon viewed his enterprise as entirely legitimate. In February of 1720, around the Cape of Good Hope, he captured 2 vessels belonging to the Ostend Company. Despite being an act of piracy, the English viewed the Ostenders as interlopers in the Eastern trade, no better than pirates. However, Englishmen were involved in the Ostend Company and were to be found aboard a ship taken by Congdon. Many of them joined the pirates, together with some Flemish crewmen. It is worth noting that after Congdon's capture of the Ostenders, the East India Company ceased their discussion of the Ostend intrusion, perhaps out of embarrassment or fear of getting involved. Congdon, unaware of this, next engaged a 50-gun Dutchman. Several of the pirates were killed, and after a long fight, they retired. A few weeks later, the dragon arrived on the island of St. Mary, located off the coast of Madagascar. And pirates had traditionally used this bit of land as a trading hub, and Congdon established himself here as a smuggler and slave trader. British traders, independent of the trading companies, would travel to Madagascar to buy slaves from the natives or the pirates, in return for various provisions. Whilst many of the slaves were taken from conflicts between the local tribes, Congdon seemed to have carried a number of enslaved people captured in Guinea, possibly even Brazil. He seemingly had difficulties selling them elsewhere. His first customer was the Henrietta of London, captained by Richard Herbert. It is unknown what they traded. A few months later, Herbert was in Fort Dauphin on the southern tip of Madagascar, where he encountered the Prince Eugene of Bristol, commanded by Joseph Stratton. In 1719, her owners had requested the EIC for permission to trade slaves at Madagascar. The company declined, but the prince departed regardless. She stayed for 2 weeks at Fort Dauphin, where Richard Herbert directed her to St. Mary's Island. Here he encountered a dragon and 2 other vessels she had captured. Congdon sent out black messengers, either slaves or natives, with an invitation to Captain Stratton. Stratton agreed and gifted Congdon 2 hogsheads of brandy and a hamper of liquor. The next day, Congdon and Stratton met in the cabin of the prince, where they negotiated a deal. In return for 100 hogsheads of brandy, several chests of weapons, 70 to 80 barrels of gunpowder, and other sundry provisions, Stratton received several cases of Spanish dollars and a boatload of slaves. He spent several days relaxing on St. Mary's Island, one eyewitness reporting that Congdon and he could often be found drinking together under a tree. On the day before departing, they had a final dinner together, so it seems like they became pretty good friends. Stratton would later be arrested, not for having dealt with pirates or possessing stolen Spanish gold, but for bypassing the East India's monopoly on trade in the Indian Ocean. For Congdon, things were going smoothly. Owing to a French manuscript documenting pirate life on St. Mary's, we get a colourful idea of how Captain Congdon might have lived. The natural harbour was able to house 4 or 5 ships, with a suitable place for careening, and an islet in the middle of the shallow bay which could be used as a stronghold. Each captain possessed his own house or bungalow, standing on stilts, his possession marked by a silk pennant of various colours, bearing individual marks or symbols. Most of the pirates had 1 or more native women as a mistress, unto whom they would gift many lavish presents. However, these women had a tendency of growing jealous, and could become dangerous, murderous. More on that in a bit. Congdon made dealings with 2 other ships, both from Bristol, the Gascon and Rebecca. Having now repaired his ships and filled up on supplies, he sailed to India for a piratical cruise. Congdon is often associated with this pirate flag, showing a triple of skulls aligned in a row against a black background. There are no period records attributing these colors to him. It appears at its earliest in an illustration from a Mariner's Mirror publication of 1912, and wasn't even attributed to Condon until 1933, in Pirates of the Eastern Seas by Charles Gray, without any evidence. It isn't unlikely that Condon or anyone else would have used it. It isn't an alien design, and there were stranger pirate flags, like this one flown by Olivier Levasseur, which has 4 skulls, teardrops, and instead, the only flag ever documented to have been used by Condon was the regular skull and crossbones, reported in a newspaper from 1718. In August of 1720, near Mumbai in India, Condon captured a 500-ton Arabic ship, the Farsa Ramansi, one of the richest prizes in pirate history. Little is known about the engagement itself, but aboard of her was gold, opium, spices, silk, and jewels like diamonds, rubies, and emeralds. The owners demanded a restitution from the East India Company worth 20 lakhs of rupees, circa £205,000, and each pirate of the 137-strong crew earned a share of £900. Richard Moore, a surgeon held captive by Richard Taylor, called this treasure "riches enough to maintain them handsomely, as long as they lived." Condon and his men figured this to be enough, and decided to break up the company. For so many pirates, this had been a dream. Set to sea, capture a ship full of treasure, and retire, in wealth and affluence and good health. It would rarely be so easy for most of them, as all of us know, but for Condon and his gang, it seemed to be. Unfortunately, they would have a rough road ahead of them. Before he could reach his golden destiny, 2/3 of his crew would be poisoned, his ship wrecked, and his life nearly taken by a violent storm. Condon and company returned to St. Mary, where they encountered another smuggler wishing to buy slaves, the Cooker, commanded by Master Henry Baker. However, unlike his previous pleasant dealings, Condon kidnapped the Cooker's captain, surgeon, carpenter, and 2 sailors, as well as taking 4 pipes of wine and liquor. As for the spirits, you can probably guess what the pirates did with that, and as for the persons, they were to be kept as hostages, in return for the Cooker going to Île-Bourbon and acquiring a French pardon for the pirates. As a gesture of goodwill, Condon sent 3 surgeons he had captured from the Ostenders, one of them a Parisian. Baker and the surgeons arrived in Bourbon on the 15th of November, 1720. The French governor was glad to receive them, since he had orders from the French East India Company to pardon pirates and settle them on the islands, believing their ships and riches would be useful for the economy. And so began several months of intense negotiations. And Condon promised that if he wouldn't receive an amnesty, he and his men would fortify themselves on Madagascar and do, quote, the most harm and injury, till they received a pardon from Europe. The governor wanted the pirates to promise they would only settle down on Bourbon, surrender their weapons, and destroy their ships. They should only bring their most mild-mannered slaves, and each pirate was only allowed to keep 1 slave for himself. The rest were to be sold for 20 piastres per head. By the end of December, Condon and Governor de Couchon had finally come to an agreement. Shortly before departing in February of 1721, the Dragon and 2 of her prize ships were burned and scuttled in the harbour of St. Mary. It is uncertain what happened. It is possible that Condon and his men destroyed their ships at the governor's behest. Others speculate that a dispute broke out among the pirates, whether they should retire or not. Perhaps the scuffle had been with the natives, as we'll see in a bit. A group of treasure hunters claimed to have found the wreck of the Dragon, and aboard they found many valuable artifacts, which the pirates would have been better off taking with them to Île-Bourbon. This indicates that the ships were sunk hastily, whereas they had months to prepare for departure. It appears as though the ships had been moved to block the harbour. However, UNESCO claims that the ship they found is of Asian rather than European origin. Yet, many of the artifacts inside of the ship correspond to the documented career of Edward Condon. For example, they are Austrian coins from the late 17th century. And keep in mind that the Ostender Company, who Condon robbed from, was owned by Austria. The most impressive findings are of porcelain, both pots and figurines. Such items were known to have been carried aboard the Ostenders and captured by Condon. Aside from the Dragon, Congdon possessed 2 prize ships, perhaps one of them taken from India or beyond, so perhaps this could be the source of the wreck in question. Another possibility is that the ships might have been burned in a dispute with the natives. Known as the Betsimisaraka, they were ruled by a certain King Ramaromanompo, and had happily profited from trade with Congdon and his associates. They weren't exactly pleased by the news of their departure, especially so the native concubines of the pirates. Hell hath no fury like a woman scorned, and these sable sirens certainly had a trick or two up their sleeve. A farewell feast was organized for Congdon and his men, but just as they were eating, drinking, and enjoying themselves, several of the men fell ill. Congdon realized what had happened. They had been poisoned. He ordered his men to get to the ship, but many of them fell dead before even reaching the boats. Out of the 135 pirates on St. Mary's Island, only 38 managed to leave. Congdon was one of them. It isn't known if all of the rest were poisoned. It seems that a lot of the pirates decided to stay on Madagascar and live like princes. The aforementioned manuscript mentioned that 80 pirates had been poisoned by vengeful concubines in the recent years, so the number of Congdon's crew poisoned in an event like this might have been closer to 30 or even lower. One of Congdon's crewmen who decided to stay was John Plantain, who established himself as a petty king on the island. According to one highly exaggerated account, allegedly told by himself, he conquered the entire island for the sake of a woman. But Congdon's misfortunes were far from over. The ship was struck by a sudden gust of wind, flinging them straight into a winter storm. Wet and ragged, they just barely managed to stumble into Île-Bourbon on the 6th of February, 1721. Here the storm had greatly damaged the crops of the island. Whole trees of banana and cocoa had been uprooted. Owing to these shortcomings, the governor made incredibly strict requirements to their amnesty, especially in regards to provisioning. The pirates were obliged to pay for their board and lodgings, but they must be supplied with a hut, a suitable bed, a good mattress, a pillow, and blanket. Requirements were even written for their meals. The pirates were obliged to eat meat for dinner and supper, except during Lent. The meals were always to consist of meat, either boiled or roasted, with either bread or rice. For breakfast or lunch, they were given a half bottle of frangorin, a local liquor made from fermented fruit or sugar. Even though the pirates had apparently hidden some of their treasure on Madagascar, each of them still possessed 4,000 crowns in pocket money. Eyewitnesses reported how they would recklessly spend this money, only to be overcharged. And part of the reason for the reckless spending might be because they weren't able to marry before converting to Catholicism, so they might not have felt as if they had many options. Many of them did, however, settle down on Bourbon and established themselves in agriculture. Even though Congdon and his company had retired, other pirates still roamed the sea. During Congdon's stay on Bourbon, Jasper Seeger and Olivier Levasseur captured the Nossa Senhora do Cabo, as she lay broken and anchored in the northern harbour of Île-Bourbon. Congdon distinguished himself as a diplomat between the governor of Bourbon and the pirate company, amongst whom he possibly had old acquaintances. Even though Congdon's initial efforts had mixed results, the pirates eventually agreed to release their prisoners. Seeger and Levasseur's companies would not accept a pardon, however, but continued piracy. The French were fine with this, since they mostly stole from the Portuguese, Dutch, and English. Levasseur would not become a problem until a few years later, when he decided to take the pardon, but went against it by settling on Madagascar and establishing himself as an independent slave trader, and rival of the French East India Company. And this resulted in his unfortunate death in 1730, marking the final end of the Golden Age. I've told this story rather extensively in his dedicated biography, and I suggest giving it a look after this one. Even though Congdon had done a service on Bourbon, he had no intentions of remaining. He had earned the governor's respect after serving him as a negotiator, and he used this leverage to marry his sister-in-law, Marie-Catherine Ancret. The two of them departed together aboard a company ship back to France, arriving on the 23rd of February, 1723, in Port Louis, Brittany. A month later, on the 25th of March, the couple signed their marriage contract, The signing was witnessed by François Bourry de Riquebourg, the king's lieutenant, and a man of extraordinary power. The ceremony must certainly have been regarded as important. 4 days later, Riquebourg and the widow of his predecessor would also attend the wedding ceremony at the Church of Our Lady of the Assumption. The marriage between Congdon and Ancret was most likely one of convenience between the both of them. Congdon benefited from having powerful family connections, and Ancret, an ambitious businesswoman, needed a man's legitimacy in a man's world. It can also be presumed that Congdon converted to Catholicism, since Protestants weren't allowed to marry Catholics. The tale of Edward Congdon is short and sweet. It is fascinating that his story is essentially the gold standard of what every pirate hoped to achieve. Go to sea, capture a ship full of treasure, and retire into prestige and affluence. Congdon was fortunate in that he achieved what he came looking for, whereas so many others were unsuccessful. Even though his richest capture, the Rasa, did not carry as much treasure as the Nossa Senhora, Congdon ended up better than the masterminds of its capture. Jasper Seeger died on Madagascar, Olivier Levasseur lost his treasure and was executed a few years later. Richard Taylor is a close second to Congdon, but his fate isn't well documented, and it was said that he didn't really use his money in a good manner. This might have been the end of our story. Most of them usually are, after the pirates retire and slip into obscurity. However, we do know what happened next. On the 7th of October, 1723, Congdon purchased a 40-ton brigantine, which he rechristened St. Catherine in honor of his wife. And Catherine used her own finances to equip the vessel for trading, and apart from purchasing the vessel for her, it seems as if Congdon had no play in this part of the business. It was all Catherine. It appears he oversaw commercial operations in Port Louis, something he had experience in after his time on St. Mary. Thus, while Congdon's story is stereotypical, it also defies popular conception by showing the close link between piracy and trade, and it is interesting to see Congdon putting his mercantile experience into legitimate practice. You might remember how the retired pirates were authorized to only keep a single slave. It seems as if Congdon was still accompanied by his. The slave was baptized at Our Lady of the Assumption on the 10th of September, 1724. Hey look, that's almost exactly 300 years ago, what do you know? However, the priest noted how he still belonged to Monsieur de Congdon. Relations between master and slave were not always harsh in the period, and oftentimes could be quite intimate. But it must be remembered that the man, whose name I was unable to find, was still there against his will, even if his options were probably limited, and ending up as a manservant of an affluent merchant, who he probably had a friendly connection to, was probably superior to alternatives. Congdon had brought with him other friends. A man named Pierre Faurbin was master of his 60-ton ship, Saint René, and Pierre was related to one of the signees of Congdon's pardon, a certain Antoine Boucher du Forge, who would eventually become governor of Bourbon. Congdon was surrounded by an air of nobility, and even called himself a negociant of Port Louis. He continued maritime transactions and often interacted with his countrymen across the channel. Indeed, his new home at Lorient is located just a stone's throw away from his birthplace at Plymouth. A few years later, it seems he began longing for the sea. In 1726, he sailed twice to La Rochelle as master of the 40-ton brigantine François Louis. After this warm-up voyage, Congdon would take personal control of the Saint René and sail her to Bordeaux, Honfleur, Rouen, and even Spain. He spent the remaining years of his life at sea. On the 2nd of May, 1734, he passed away peacefully in his bed. For his widow, Catherine Ancret Congdon, the story had yet to end. Shortly after his death, she remarried to a sergeant major of the city. He would inherit Congdon's mercantile empire, and she would attain a man's hand in order to continue it. And so ends the story of Edward Congdon, Billy One Hand. Short, sweet, cliché. The pirate who I call the most successful of the Golden Age. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider supporting Golden Gunpowder by making a one-time donation or becoming a channel member or Patreon supporter. For as little as $1 a month, you can watch all of my videos on Patreon without YouTube ads pestering you, and you'll also get early access to new releases. Don't forget to check out World of Warships by using the link in the video description. You can use code BRAVO during registering to get a bunch of cool upgrades. And thanks again to WoW for sponsoring this episode. More pirate stories coming soon.